Hello, this is Mr. Escaton, and today we're talking about estimating irrational numbers. In other words, what we're really talking about for the most part is estimating imperfect squares. So what is an imperfect square? Well, in order to talk about that, we have to talk about what a perfect square is. A perfect square is any whole number that and when I talk about whole numbers, I'm talking about numbers that are greater than 0 that have no decimals or fractions. So numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. So I'm talking about a whole number that if I take two smaller whole numbers that are identical and I multiply them together, I get the whole number I started with. For example, let's take the number 9. Well, I know that the square root of 9 is equal to 3 times 3. I also know that 3 and 3 are both identical whole numbers. And since I'm multiplying them together, I end up getting another whole number. So in other words, 9 is what we call a perfect square. So now that we know what a perfect square is, let's talk about the perfect squares between the numbers 1 and 10. Let's start with the number 1. Well, can you guys think of any two identical numbers that are whole numbers that if I multiply together, I can get 1? I can. I know that 1 times 1 gives me 1. So 1 is a perfect square. What about 2? Not 2. I mean, if I tried to think of two identical whole numbers that gave me 2, maybe 1 point something times 1 point something, or 1 in some fraction times 1 in some fraction, but gives me 2. But again, we're talking about decimals and fractions. So 2 is not a perfect square. The same thing with 3. What about 4? Yeah, 4 is a perfect square because 2 times 2 gives me 4. So 4 is a perfect square. What about 5? Not 5. Same thing with 6. Same thing with 7. Same thing with 8. What about 9? Yeah, we just talked about this. 3 times 3 gives me 9. Correction, not 3 times 9. 3 times 3 gives me 9. So I know that 9 is a perfect square. What about 10? Nope, not 10 either. So in other words, between the numbers 1 and 10, there are 3 perfect squares: 1, 4, and 9. Those are the 3 perfect squares between the numbers 1 and 10. 3 what? Was. Well, I already know that 3 is not a perfect square, okay? So we got to estimate what this number would actually be. How can we estimate this without a calculator? Before we do that, instead of talking about the square root of 3, we're just going to talk about the regular number 3. And we have to ask ourselves this first question: what two perfect squares is 3 between? So if I started at 3 and I moved backwards, so my numbers got smaller. Let's go to the number 2. Is 2 a perfect square? It's not. What about 1? Well, we know that 1 is a perfect square. So 3 is larger than the first perfect square, which is 1. Now we're going to talk about numbers that are bigger than 3. Let's go to 4. Is 4 a perfect square? Yeah, we already know that. So that means that 3 is between the numbers 1 and 4. Well, logically, if 3 is between 1 and 4, then logically the square root of 3 has to be between the square root of 1 and the square root of 4. So in other words, let's write this out. I know that the square root of 3 has to be has to be bigger than the square root of 1. What is the square root of 1? Well, we already know that the square root of 1 is 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. So that means the square root of 3 is bigger than 1. And it has to be smaller than the square root of 4. What is the square root of 4? Well, I know that the square root of 4 is 2. So what that means is the square root of 3 has to be bigger than than 1, and it has to be smaller than 2. In other words, the square root of 3 is going to be 1 and some decimal. Well, how do I figure out what that decimal is? Well, in order to do that, we do a little subtraction. So I know that the square root of 3 is going to be 1 and some decimal or 1 and some fraction. In order to do that, we're going to turn it into a fraction. So when we talk about a fraction, we are talking about a numerator and a denominator. So how do we figure out what the numerator is? In order to do that, we look at our original square roots right here. And what I'm going to do to figure out my numerator is we are going to take the middle number and we are going to subtract the smaller number. So the numerator is equal to 3 minus 1, which gives us 2. That is our numerator. Now for the denominator, we're going to take the larger number and we're going to subtract the smaller number. So in other words, the denominator is equal to 4 minus 1, which gives us 3. In other words, the square root of 3 is about 1 and 2/3. 1 and 2/3. Now, some of you guys can figure out that if I take 2/3 and I convert it to a decimal, that gives me 0.6 repeating. So roughly, the square root of 3 is equal to about 1.6 repeating. Again, this is Mr. Escaton. We're talking about estimating irrational numbers.